the 25th of October 1944. 4. The waters off Samar Island are a suffocating black. The air is thick, humid, and still, clinging to the skin of the sailors aboard the ships of Taffy 3. This is escort duty, the unglamorous tail end of the largest naval battle in history. The men of the destroyer escort USS Johnston, designated DE 413, are at routine quarters, scanning the pre-dawn horizon. They are the picket line, the guard dogs for a group of slow, vulnerable jeep carriers, Task Unit 77.4.3. Their job is to hunt submarines, not fight battleships. The first hint of dawn reveals a smudge of grey to the northeast. Then another. A bridge watchman raises his binoculars. The smudges do not resolve into familiar, friendly shapes. They resolve into the impossible, pagoda-style masts. The largest superstructures any of them have ever seen. A young signalman, his voice cracking, reports to the bridge. Enemy ships on the horizon. I see pagoda masts. The Japanese center force, Admiral Kurita's massive armada featuring the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, had slipped through the San Bernardino Strait. It was a fleet that was not supposed to be there, a fleet that by all rights should have been at the bottom of the Sibuyan Sea. Yet here it was, bearing down on the thin-skinned carriers with guns that could obliterate the Johnston from a distance the destroyer's own shells could not even hope to cross. This is the story of the USS Johnston, but it is not merely a chronicle of a naval engagement. It is a testament to the precise moment when the cold, brutal arithmetic of industrial warfare, armor thickness, shell weight, and tonnage was challenged by the unquantifiable variable of human will. The battle off Samar was not a fight. It was, by every metric, an execution. But the men of the Johnston, led by a commander who refused to accept the logic of his own destruction, would prove that the conviction of a few, in one desperate, suicidal charge, could shatter the resolve of the many, and, in doing so, save an invasion. This was the day the destroyers fought like battleships, and a legend was forged in steel, smoke, and salt water. On the bridge of the Johnston there was no hesitation. There was no committee meeting. There was only Commander Ernest E. Evans. Evans, a man of Cherokee and Oklahoman heritage, was not a product of the peacetime Navy's starched collar bureaucracy. He was a fighter. He had reportedly told his crew during commissioning, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." No one had left. Now, faced with a force that outgunned him perhaps 100 to 1, his instincts were not to run, not to report, but to attack. Before the task group commander, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, could even issue an order, Evans's voice cut through the ship's intercom system. Survivors recall his words with chilling clarity. He did not ask for permission. He gave a command. On the Johnston, he barked, "All hands, stand by to repel attack. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds, from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." He ordered the ship into a hard turn, straight toward the enemy, laying a smokescreen to cover the fleeing carriers. The Johnston was the first to maneuver, the first to commit. For the men at the gun mounts, the reality of the situation was visceral. Robert Hagen, a gunner, remembered the feeling of utter helplessness mixed with a frantic, adrenaline-fueled purpose. "We were in a situation where you couldn't be afraid," Hagen would later state. "You didn't have time to be afraid. The size of the enemy was incomprehensible." The Japanese shells began to arrive, not as a whistle, but as a deafening roar. They were dyed with colour, landing in the water around Taffy 3 inches massive, terrifying splashes of red, green, and orange. It was the first time many of the Americans had seen this tactic, designed to help Japanese spotters identify which ship's salvo had landed where. To the men of Taffy 3, it just looked like hell was erupting around them. Hagen and his crewmates on the 5-inch guns knew what they had. Their shells were high-capacity rounds, devastating against aircraft or unarmored targets. But against the belt armor of a heavy cruiser or a battleship, they were, as one sailor put it, like throwing pebbles. They aimed for the superstructures, hoping to blind the enemy, to knock out rangefinders, to kill officers, anything to make them stop. This was the mismatch. It is a word that fails to capture the sheer industrial disparity. The USS Johnston was a Fletcher-class destroyer, displacing 2,100 tons. She was 376 feet long. Her main armament consisted of 5-inch guns. These guns fired a shell weighing approximately 55 pounds to a maximum effective range of about 9 miles. Against an armoured target, they were almost useless unless fired from point-blank range. Now, consider the enemy. The lead ship of Kurita's force was the Yamato. The Yamato displaced 72,000 tons, more than all of Taffy 3 combined. Her main battery consisted of 9 18.1-inch guns. These guns fired a shell that weighed 3,219 pounds, a shell heavier than a Volkswagen Beetle. Its effective range was over 25 miles, far beyond the Johnston's ability to even reply. The Yamato's belt armor was 16 inches thick, designed to repel shells of its own caliber. A 5-inch shell from the Johnston would not even scratch its paint. It would simply detonate on the outside like a firecracker. The Johnston, by contrast, had what sailors called tin can armor. Its hull plating was just over half an inch thick, designed only to stop splinters, not shells. A single hit from a Japanese destroyer, let alone a battleship, could be fatal. The logic of 20th century naval warfare was built on these numbers. Battles were decided by tonnage, armor, and gun caliber. By this logic, the USS Johnston and the rest of Taffy 3 were already dead. They were a rounding error in the Japanese fleet's calculations. They were not a threat. They were a target. The appearance of Kurita's force on the horizon was not the beginning of a battle. It was the beginning of a slaughter. But Commander Evans, spitting orders from his bridge, and Robert Hagen, slamming another useless 55-pound shell into the breech of his gun, had not read the script. They were about to defy the cold, hard math of the industrial age. The Johnston, trailing smoke and charging headlong into a wall of gunfire, was about to become the ship that did the impossible. The charge of the USS Johnston was an act of isolated, instinctive defiance. But it was not an isolated ship. The Johnston was merely the sharpest point of a very small spearhead, the screening element for Task Unit 77.4.3, known by its call sign, Taffy 3. To understand the sheer insanity of what was happening, one must zoom out from the Johnston's bridge and look at the order of battle. Taffy 3 was, by every definition, a support unit. Commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Ziggy Sprague, its core consisted of 6 escort carriers, essentially floating platforms for aircraft. These were not the fleet carriers of naval legend. They were small, slow, and unarmored, built on merchant ship hulls. They were nicknamed jeep carriers, or, more ominously, combustible, vulnerable, expendable. Their purpose was to provide air cover for amphibious landings and hunt submarines. They had no armor, a top speed that was barely faster than a battleship, and a single, tiny 5-inch gun at the stern that was all but useless. Protecting this flock of flammable carriers was a screen of just 3 destroyers, the Johnston, the Hoel, and the Heermann, and 4 even smaller destroyer escorts. This was Taffy 3, a unit designed to swat at flies, not fight dragons. And then the dragons appeared. Kurita's center force was the antithesis of Taffy 3. It was the concentrated striking power of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a fleet in being that represented the pinnacle of 1932 naval industrial design. It was composed of 4 battleships, including the Yamato, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Where Taffy 3 was designed for support, the center force was designed for one purpose: to find and kill other battleships. It was a sledgehammer forged to shatter the main line of the American Pacific Fleet. Instead, through a series of colossal errors and misjudgments on both sides, This sledgehammer was now bearing down on a small group of tin-plated support ships. The most powerful surface fleet assembled since Midway had stumbled not upon Admiral Halsey's third fleet, as they had hoped, but upon Ziggy Sprague's collection of jeep carriers. On the bridge of his flagship, the Fanshawe Bay, Admiral Sprague was in a state of professional shock. The first reports of enemy ships were dismissed. When his own radar confirmed the contacts, his mind raced through the possibilities. As he later detailed in his after-action report, his first assumption was that this must be Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, or some part of the Seventh Fleet's battleship line. He wrote, "I thought it could be no part of the Seventh Fleet. It could only be Halsey's Third Fleet." The realization that it was, in fact, the main Japanese battle line was so absurd, so outside the realm of possibility, that it took several minutes to process. The reports were unequivocal. Enemy composed of 4 battleships, 7 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Sprague, a man known for his composure, was dumbfounded. He famously grabbed his intercom and announced to the ships of Taffy 3 the grim, almost comical, truth of their situation. A quote that would go down in naval history: "This is a situation I've been unable to get in the books. I have a light raspberry against what I can only assume is the entire Japanese fleet." His light raspberry was Taffy 3. This confusion, however, was not one-sided. This dual conflict of perception was, in fact, one of the most critical factors in the battle. From the bridges of the Japanese ships, Taffy 3 looked nothing like what it was. The Japanese lookouts, straining through the morning haze and the smoke of the American destroyers, reported the impossible. They reported sighting a full American fleet. In their minds, no one would be stupid enough to use small escort carriers in a fleet engagement, so the flat tops times must times be the fast, full-sized fleet carriers of the Essex class. The charging destroyers and destroyer escorts, maneuvering with suicidal aggression, must times be heavy cruisers, the only ships that would logically attempt such an attack. As noted in Japanese after-action accounts, officers on the cruiser Kumano were convinced they were engaging American heavy cruisers at point-blank range. This misidentification had 2 profound effects. First, it made the Japanese admirals cautious. If these were fleet carriers, their powerful air groups would soon be launching a devastating counterstrike. Second, it caused them to waste time and ammunition. They fired armor-piercing AP shells, designed to penetrate the thick belts of battleships at the tin cans. These heavy shells, finding no armor to detonate against, often passed straight through the thin hulls of the American destroyers without exploding, saving many lives, at least for a time. The raw industrial numbers tell the true story. This was not a battle. It was a statistical execution. Let us look at the tail of the tape. Taffy 3, in total, possessed 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. Their entire heavy armament consisted of the 25 5-inch guns on the destroyers and destroyer escorts. The total weight of a single broadside from all of these guns combined was approximately 1,400 pounds. Now, consider Kurita's center force. 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, 6 heavy, 2 light, and 11 destroyers. This fleet mounted, among its main armaments, 9 18.1-inch guns, 8 16-inch guns, 32 14-inch guns, and dozens of 8-inch and 6-inch guns. The weight of a single broadside from just times the battleships and heavy cruisers was over 160,000 pounds. In a single volley, Kurita could hurl more than 100 times the weight of steel as Taffy 3. The shells from Yamato alone weighed more than an entire Taffy 3 destroyer. This was the force that Commander Evans had just turned his ship towards. This was the fleet that Admiral Sprague now had to save his carriers from. Sprague's only hope, his only option, was to run. He ordered his carriers to turn south, into the wind, to launch their aircraft. He knew his planes, armed mostly with anti-submarine depth charges and light fragmentation bombs, could do little against a battleship. But they were all he had. To launch those planes, he needed time. The carriers were slow. The Japanese fleet was fast. The only thing standing between Kurita's Goliaths and the vulnerable jeep carriers was the tiny screen of tin cans. They were the sacrificial lambs. And as the Johnston laid its smoke screen, the other destroyers of the screen, the Hoel and the Heermann and the tiny destroyer escorts, understood their role. They were the bait. They had to be. They followed the Johnston's lead, turning to face the wall of steel. The men of Taffy 3, choking on the smoke of their own screens and deafened by the roar of Japanese 18-inch guns, were not just outnumbered. They were alone. They were the abandoned pawns in a colossal strategic gamble, the forgotten piece on a chessboard the size of the entire Philippine archipelago. To understand why the USS Johnston was forced to charge a battleship, one must look hundreds of miles to the north, to the high-stakes deception that had, against all odds, succeeded. The Japanese called this plan Shogo, or Victory Operation. It was not so much a plan as a desperate, all-or-nothing final roll of the dice for the entire Imperial Japanese Navy, a force already crippled by the loss of pilots, fuel, and industrial capacity. The goal was simple and suicidal: lure the main American striking force, the battleships and fast carriers of the Third Fleet, away from the invasion beaches at Leyte Gulf. Once the main American protector was gone, the Japanese center force, Kurita's armada, would slip through the unguarded San Bernardino Strait, turn south, and annihilate the undefended American invasion shipping. The entire operation was a trap, and the bait had to be irresistible. The dual conflict that doomed Taffy 3 was not fought on the water, but in the radio waves and conflicting personalities of the American High Command. The Seventh Fleet, which included Taffy 3, was under the command of Admiral Thomas Kinkaid. It was the invasion fleet, responsible for landing and protecting the troops on Leyte. The Third Fleet, the main striking arm of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific, was under the command of Admiral William Bull Halsey. Crucially, the command structure was divided. Kinkaid reported to General MacArthur, Halsey reported to Admiral Nimitz. There was no single commander on site. Halsey, an aggressive, pugnacious carrier admiral, saw his mission as singular: destroy the Japanese fleet. When his scout planes spotted the bait, the Japanese Northern Force, commanded by Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa Halsey, saw his chance to deliver a death blow. He believed Kurita's center force, which his planes had already attacked in the Sibuyan Sea, was beaten and retreating. He made one of the most controversial decisions of the entire war. He would take his entire Third Fleet, including its battleships, and race north to destroy Ozawa's carriers. In his memoirs, Halsey would fiercely defend this decision, writing, "I believed that the Japs were capable of complete self-annihilation. I was certain that Ozawa's primary mission was to draw the Third Fleet away. He was correct, but he failed to consider the secondary consequences. He was the cork in the bottle. When he moved his fleet north, he pulled the cork, leaving the San Bernardino Strait the gateway to Kinkaid's vulnerable invasion fleet completely unguarded. Kinkaid, meanwhile, assumed times Halsey had left a contingent of ships, a Task Force 34, to guard the strait. He had no reason to believe Halsey would take his entire fleet on a chase. This assumption, this critical failure of communication, was the death sentence for the men of Taffy 3. The bait itself, Ozawa's Northern Force, was a phantom. It was the perfect lure for an admiral like Halsey. On paper, it looked like a formidable threat. 4 aircraft carriers, 2 hybrid battleship carriers, and a screen of cruisers and destroyers. It was the last remnant of the Japanese carrier fleet. But this was an industrial illusion. The carriers were real, but they were empty. The statistical hammer of the war had already fallen on the Japanese Naval Air Service. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, had decimated their trained pilots. Ozawa's 4 carriers sailed into battle with a combined total of fewer than 115 aircraft, many of them obsolete. His pilots were, for the most part, barely trained cadets. Halsey's Task Force 38, by contrast, was charging north with over 1,000 top-of-the-line aircraft, and the best-trained pilots in the world. Ozawa knew his mission was one of sacrifice. He was, as one historian noted, a condemned man, ordered to make his execution as conspicuous as possible. He deliberately broke radio silence, steaming in plain sight, doing everything in his power to be seen by Halsey's reconnaissance. The Shogo plan, a complex mess of moving parts, had worked. Halsey, blinded by his desire for a decisive carrier-on-carrier battle, took the bait. He steamed north at flank speed, leaving behind a 60-mile-wide gap in the American naval line. Kincaid, believing he was protected, stayed focused on the landings. And into this gap, precisely as planned, steamed Kurita's center force, which had not retreated but had merely licked its wounds and reversed course. The trap had sprung. The Japanese had successfully traded a hollow, pilotless decoy fleet for a clear, unimpeded shot at the heart of the American invasion. There was only one problem, one tiny, unforeseen variable they had not accounted for: the suicidal, defiant, and utterly illogical courage of a few tin-can sailors. The USS Johnston and the rest of Taffy 3 were not supposed to be a fleet. They were supposed to be victims. They were the bait in the trap, left to be consumed by the Goliaths that had just broken through the gate. The grand strategic failure, the miscommunication between admirals, and the success of the Japanese decoy had set the stage. But the battle off Samar, in its most critical moment, did not hinge on admirals or fleet-wide strategies. It hinged on the decision of one man, standing on the exposed bridge of a single destroyer. The entire fate of Taffy 3, and perhaps the Leyte invasion itself, rested on the shoulders of Commander Ernest E. Evans. In the seconds after the pagoda masts were identified, the logic of the situation was undeniable. Taffy 3 was doomed. The correct, logical, by-the-book response was to report the contact, deploy smoke to cover the carrier's retreat, and save the destroyers for as long as possible. To charge, however, was not a tactical decision. It was a suicidal one. It was an act of profound defiance against the unassailable math of the situation. Evans, in that moment, became the physical embodiment of the unquantifiable variable. He looked at the 72,000-ton Yamato, looked at his 2,100-ton Johnston, and chose to attack. This decision was not made in a vacuum. It was the culmination of a lifetime of character. Ernest E. Evans was not a typical peacetime officer. He was a Naval Academy graduate, but he was also, as he was proud to state, a full-blooded Cherokee, born in Oklahoma. He was known in the service as all-fighter. There was a tenacity to him, a core of unshakable resolve that his fellow officers respected and, perhaps, slightly feared. He was a man who saw the world in clear, stark terms of duty. This conviction was most famously displayed when the USS Johnston was first commissioned. Gathering his new crew, many of them green, untested sailors, he laid out his personal doctrine in words that were now, in the waters off Samar, becoming a terrible prophecy. He told them, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." No one left. Now, faced with Kurita's fleet, harm's way was an understatement. This was oblivion. But Evans's promise was not a piece of rhetoric. It was a contract. He had promised them a fight, and he was a man who kept his word. That conviction, that singular, burning purpose, had to be transferred to over 300 men. A ship's captain is only as effective as his crew's belief in him. For the men on the Johnston, the dual conflict of the moment was overwhelming. On one hand, there was the visceral, paralyzing terror. The Japanese shells were landing, the colored splashes towering over their ship. They could see, with their naked eyes, the winking flashes of guns that were larger than their entire bridge. But on the other hand, there was the skipper. Survivor accounts, from men like gunner Robert Hagen, are uniform in their description. While they were terrified of the enemy, they had an absolute, unshakable faith in Commander Evans. They had trained under him. They knew his temperament. When his voice came over the 1MC, the ship's intercom, it was not panicked or fearful. It was, as survivors recalled, a voice of pure, cold rage. He was angry times at the Japanese for daring to threaten his ships. This anger, this conviction, flowed from the bridge to the engine room, from the fire control tower to the gun mounts. The men didn't have time to be scared. They had a job to do, and the skipper was leading them. They were not just following orders, they were following Evans. Evans' charge, while seemingly born of pure suicidal rage, was also a desperate tactical calculation. It was the only offensive option he had. His first, most critical job was to make smoke. He ordered his ship to generate as much black stack smoke as possible, creating an artificial squall to hide the jeep carriers that had begun their turn to the south. But smoke alone would not stop Kurita. Evans needed to make the Japanese want times to turn away. He needed to inflict pain. His only real weapon, the only thing on his ship that could threaten a battleship or a heavy cruiser, was his rack of 10 Mark 15 torpedoes. These were his silver bullets. But to use them, he had to get close. The Mark 15 had a range of about 10,000 yards. The Japanese were firing at him from 30,000 yards. His gamble was to charge 20,000 yards under the guns of the entire Japanese fleet to get into firing range. He was not, however, aiming for the Yamato, which was too far away. He had identified the lead element of the Japanese attack, a squadron of heavy cruisers, led by the Kumano. That was his target. To survive this run, he gave a legendary order, one that demonstrated his superb seamanship. Commence zigzagging, small zigzags, 1-degree rudder. He was attempting to chase the salvos, maneuvering his ship to where the last splashes had landed, while the 1-degree zags were just enough to throw off the analog computers of the Japanese rangefinders. This was the moment. The Johnston, trailing a thick plume of smoke, was charging alone, its 5-inch guns barking defiantly, like a puppy yapping at a pack of wolves, as one survivor put it. This singular act of aggression, this immediate, violent, and unauthorized charge, was the spark. On the bridges of the other ships in Taffy 3's screen, the Howell, the Heerman, the Samuel B. Roberts, they all saw the same thing. They saw the Johnston, the flagship of their little screen, not retreating but attacking. Commander Evans had, in effect, seized tactical command of the entire group by sheer force of will. He had shamed them into action. If the Johnston was going in, they were all going in. The Wolfpack was about to gather, and the battle for Samar had truly begun. The USS Johnston was now committed. It was a 20,000-yard sprint, a distance that must be covered while the entire Japanese center force tried to kill her. The run was a sensory nightmare. The air was filled with the deafening, ripping sound of incoming shells, a noise survivors described not as a whistle, but as the sound of an entire freight train passing overhead. Then came the splashes. The Japanese, using their die-marked shells, were straddling the Johnston. Massive plumes of coloured water, red, green, orange, erupted on all sides, towering hundreds of feet into the air, drenching the decks and the men. The ship shuddered violently, not just from the near misses, but from Commander Evans's frantic manoeuvring. He was chasing the salvos, a desperate gamble of seamanship, steering the ship into the columns of water left by the last salvo, betting that the Japanese gunners could not correct their aim fast enough. All the while, the Johnston's own 5-inch guns were firing as fast as their crews could load, a frantic, yapping defiance. It was, as one gunner recalled, a desperate attempt to make them keep their heads down. The 55-pound shells were completely ineffective against the heavy armour of the cruisers they were aimed at, but they were aimed at the bridges, at the rangefinders, at the men. On the bridge, Evans was a pillar of pure, focused rage, his voice never wavering as he called out the orders for the zigzag. His target was locked. He was not charging blindly into the mass of ships. He had singled out the leader, the heavy cruiser Kumano, the flagship of Cruiser Division 7. The Johnston, her engines straining at flank speed, was cutting the gap, 30,000 yards. 25,000 yards. The Japanese salvos were becoming more accurate. The ship was being hit, but by what? No one knew. The noise was too great, the chaos too absolute. Splinters of steel ripped across the superstructure. Men were hit, but the ship did not slow. Evans was waiting for the number. The fire control team, their knuckles white, were calling out the range, their voices straining over the din. 15,000 yards. Still too far. 12,000 yards. The Kumano loomed in their sights, its own 8-inch guns flashing in reply. 10,000 yards. This was it. The absolute, maximum effective range for their torpedoes. Evans gave the command. In the center of the ship, the torpedo crew, led by torpedoman's mate first class Paul H.P. Jones, had been waiting for this. They were completely exposed to the enemy fire, with no armor, no protection. Their only job was to wait for the order. When it came, it was a moment of mechanical precision in a sea of chaos. The fish were ready. The order was given to launch all 10. With a series of whooshing hisses, the Mark 15 torpedoes, each 20 feet long, leaped from their tubes and slammed into the water. They were, as one sailor put it, our full quiver. The Johnston had fired everything it had that could truly hurt the enemy. The torpedoes, powered by their own small engines, began their run, their wakes a straight, silver line in the churning water, pointed directly at the bow of the Kumano. The Johnston, its mission accomplished, did not wait to see the results. Evans immediately ordered a hard rudder, turning the ship back into its own smoke screen, desperate to escape the trap it had just set. The torpedoes ran for approximately 2 minutes. From the Japanese perspective, the charge of this single, insignificant destroyer was an act of madness, but it was a madness that was now about to bear fruit. The lookouts on the Kumano spotted the wakes. The ship began a hard, evasive turn, but it was too late. The range was too short. At least one, and possibly as many as 3, of the Johnston's torpedoes found their mark. A colossal explosion erupted on the Kumano's bow. The industrial hammer of the Johnston's attack was not its guns, but its torpedoes. The Mark 15 carried an 825-pound warhead of Torpex, an explosive 50% more powerful than standard TNT. This warhead, designed to break the back of a capital ship, did exactly what it was supposed to do. It did not just damage the Kumano, it eviscerated it. Japanese after-action reports state the hit was catastrophic. The entire bow of the 13,000-ton heavy cruiser was, in an instant, simply gone. The forward momentum of the ship caused it to buckle, its own anchor chains dragging through its hull. The ship was not sunk, but it was, for all intents and purposes, executed. It slowed to a crawl, its speed cut to almost zero, and was forced to turn away, a blazing, crippled wreck. In a single, 15-minute run, the 2,100-ton USS Johnston had found the lead Japanese cruiser, charged it, and surgically removed it from the battle. The tactical victory was staggering. Commander Evans had drawn first blood. He had, with one audacious charge, neutralized a ship nearly 7 times the size of his own and blunted the spearhead of the Japanese attack. The entire Japanese cruiser division, which had been led by the Kumano, was now in disarray, forced to maneuver around their stricken flagship. But this victory, as profound as it was, came at a terrible, immediate price. The Johnston had just announced itself as the most dangerous, most aggressive, and most hated ship on the water. As it emerged from its smokescreen to rejoin the fight, it was no longer just one of many targets. It was the Times target. The full, undivided attention of the remaining Japanese ships, the battleships, the cruisers, the destroyers, was now turning towards the small, defiant ship that had dared to strike back. The Johnston had fired its quiver, and now it was about to face the consequences. Commander Evans's charge was a solitary act of defiance, but it did not remain solitary for long. On the bridges of the other tin cans of Taffy 3, they all witnessed the same impossible sight. The Johnston, a single destroyer, charging headlong into the most powerful battleship fleet on Earth. It was a moment of profound moral reckoning for the other captains. They were under no direct order to follow. Their standing order was to protect the carriers, and the logical way to do that was to retreat with them, laying smoke. But Evans had just rewritten the rules of the engagement. His aggression was a catalyst, a moral spark that ignited the entire destroyer screen. One after another, the ships of the screen turned to follow him. The USS Howell, commanded by Commander Leon S. Kintberger, was next. Then the USS Heermann. And then, most incredibly, the tiny, absurdly outgunned destroyer escorts, the Sammy B, the Raymond, the Dennis, and the John C. Butler, also turned toward the enemy. The individual, suicidal charge of the Johnston had just become a pack attack. The Wolfpack was gathering. Commander Leon S. Kintberger on the USS Howell had orders from Admiral Sprague to form a striking force, but it was Evans's charge that gave that order its lethal urgency. Kintberger, like Evans, was a fighter. He turned his ship and aimed it, not at a cruiser, but at the lead Japanese battleship, the Congo. The Howell's run was, if anything, even more perilous than the Johnston's. She was now the lead destroyer, as the Johnston was busy with the Kumano. The Howell charged in, her 5-inch guns blazing, and became the primary target for the Japanese capital ships. Survivor accounts from the Howell describe a ship sailing through a forest of steel. She was hit, and hit hard, almost immediately. A salvo of 8-inch shells from a heavy cruiser tore through her superstructure, knocking out her aft fire control and one of her engine rooms. Yet she did not stop. Kintberger, severely wounded, continued to con the ship, bleeding on his own bridge. The Howell was a dying ship, but she was still a fighting ship. She managed to get within 9,000 yards and launch her full rack of 10 torpedoes at the Congo. The torpedoes, launched under a hail of fire, all missed their primary target, but the act of launching them forced the Congo into a hard evasive turn, taking the battleship out of the fight temporarily as it combed the wakes. The Howell, having delivered her attack, was now a wreck, dead in the water, but she had bought precious minutes. Then came the DE that fought like a battleship. The destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts was not even a destroyer. She was a 1,300-ton escort, smaller, slower, and armed with only 2 5-inch guns and, crucially, only ×3 torpedoes. Her commander, Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, was a man who shared Evans's spirit. When the battle began, he famously grabbed his ship's intercom and, in a moment of profane brilliance, announced, "This is a fighting ship and I am a fighting CO. We are going into a fight. We have a target, and we are going to attack. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds, from which survival cannot be expected." It was an almost perfect echo of Evans's own words. Copeland and his crew, who affectionately called their ship the Sammy B, picked out a target that was utterly insane, the 14,000-ton Japanese heavy cruiser Chokai. The Sammy B, with her 2 guns, charged the Chokai, a ship with 10 8-inch guns. It was a rowboat attacking a warship. The Sammy B's gunners fired with such intensity that they were firing a 5-inch shell every 5.5 seconds, a rate that was burning out their guns. They closed to 4,000 yards point-blank range and launched their 3 silver bullets. At least one of them struck the Chokai, crippling the cruiser's steering. The Sammy B then turned her guns on another cruiser, the Chikuma, and, in a David versus Goliath moment that defies belief, hit its bridge with 5-inch shells, setting it ablaze. The industrial divided by statistical hammer of this attack was not the guns, it was the torpedoes. The Japanese, particularly Admiral Kurita, were pathologically torpedo-phobic. They had seen what American torpedoes could do. Now, they were faced not with one ship, but with an entire screen of ships charging from different angles, all of them launching fish. The Johnston had launched 10, the Howell had launched 10, the Heermann, which had made its own daring run, launched 10, the Samuel B. Roberts had launched 3. This was a torpedo soup of 33 torpedoes, all converging on the Japanese line. The Japanese, who had been in a well-ordered battle formation, were now forced into a desperate, chaotic series of emergency maneuvers. Battleships and cruisers turned hard, combing the wakes, dodging the torpedoes, and, in the process, shattering their own formation. The battleships were forced to turn times away, times from the carriers to avoid the attacks. The charge of the tin cans had achieved what no logic said was possible. It had broken the momentum of the entire Japanese center force. The pursuit of the carriers had been, for the moment, completely derailed. The sacrifice of the Wolfpack was now in full swing. The Johnston, having drawn first blood, was now taking heavy fire. The whole was a burning, sinking wreck. The Samuel B. Roberts, having punched far above its weight, was absorbing dozens of hits, each one tearing the small ship apart, but the cost was worth the price. The combined, suicidal charges of these few, small ships had achieved the impossible. They had created chaos. They had blunted the Japanese spearhead. They had forced the most powerful ships in the Japanese fleet to turn and scatter. And, most importantly, they had bought time for Admiral Sprague's jeep carriers, which were now desperately trying to launch their only real weapon, the aircraft that were waiting on their flight decks. The tin cans had done their job. They had become the bait, the shield, and the spear, all at once. The USS Johnston, having fired its full quiver of torpedoes and crippled the Kumano, had earned the right to retreat. It had done more than any destroyer could be expected to do. It was damaged, it had drawn first blood, and its primary mission of launching torpedoes was complete. But as Commander Evans emerged from the smoke, he saw a scene of pure hell. The USS Hoel was being pounded by a Japanese battleship. The Sammy B was charging in, hopelessly outgunned. The carriers were still within range. The fight was not over. Evans, his ship already listing, his bridge pockmarked with shrapnel, made a decision that sealed his fate and cemented his legend. He was not retreating. He ordered the Johnston to turn back times into times the fight. He would draw the fire. He would become the shield. His ship, having been the spear, would now become the anvil. He ordered his gunners to open fire on the nearest Japanese cruiser, the Chikuma, not to sink it, but to get its attention. It was a call to a duel he could not win, a deliberate act of self-sacrifice to save the other ships of Taffy 3. The Japanese were more than happy to oblige. The Johnston's earlier impertinence in striking the Kumano had made her a marked ship. Now, as she re-emerged, the heavy ships of Kurita's line turned their guns upon her. The battleship Congo, its 14-inch guns searching for a target, found one. A salvo of 3 14-inch shells, each weighing as much as a small car, screamed in. They did not just hit the Johnston, they eviscerated it. One shell punched straight through the deck and into the forward engine room, exploding with catastrophic force, cutting the ship's speed in half. Another hit the same area, severing power to the aft gun mounts. Then came a third salvo, this time from a cruiser. 3 6-inch shells slammed directly into the bridge. The effect was instantaneous and horrific. The bridge, the ship's entire nerve center, was obliterated in a flash of orange, white, and red. All communications were severed. The gyro compass was destroyed. The ship's primary steering was gone. In a matter of seconds, the Johnston was transformed from a fighting ship into a burning, drifting wreck. But a ship is its crew, and a crew is its captain. Commander Ernest Evans was on the bridge when it was hit. He should have been killed. By all rights, he was. But the will of the man was stronger than the steel that had just torn him apart. When the smoke cleared, the survivors on the deck were met with a horrifying sight. Evans, his uniform tattered, was staggering out of the wreckage. He was, as gunner Robert Hagen would later recall, stripped to the waist, his clothes having been blown off by the blast. He was covered in blood. His left hand was a mangled ruin. Several fingers were gone. His face and chest were riddled with shrapnel. He was, by any medical definition, a man in mortal agony. but he was not in shock. He was, as he had been from the beginning, in a state of pure, unadulterated rage. He saw that the ship was still, barely, moving. He knew his duty. The bridge was gone. He had to steer the ship from somewhere else. His command was now a dual conflict against the enemy and his own broken body. He made his way from the shattered bridge, down the ladders, to the aft steering station, known as the fantail. Here, deep in the stern, was the emergency steering gear. It was a manual system, a set of massive gears designed to be turned by hand if the bridge was destroyed. The men there were in a steel box, blind to the outside world, waiting for orders that could no longer come through the intercom. Evans found the open hatch leading down to them. He was now, in effect, a 19th-century admiral, conning his ship by shouting. He yelled down the hatch, his voice raw. "Right rudder! Left rudder! Steady as you go!" He was steering the ship, not with a wheel, but with his voice, manually guiding the rudder as he watched the Japanese salvos land, trying to dodge the splashes. It is one of the most enduring images of naval warfare. A mutilated captain, his ship on fire, his bridge gone, steering his destroyer from the stern by yelling commands through a hole in the deck. And the ship was still fighting. While Evans steered, the guns that still had power were still firing. The Johnston was now in a point-blank gun duel with a Japanese light cruiser and several destroyers. The range was so short, the combat so intimate, that the men on the 5-inch guns were not even using their rangefinders. They were firing in director, just pointing and shooting. The Johnston's gunners, in a final act of incredible defiance, pumped over 200 rounds into the superstructure of the cruiser Chikuma, setting it ablaze. The Johnston was dying, but it was taking a piece of the enemy with it. It was at this moment that the industrial divided by statistical hammer of the battle revealed its greatest irony. The Johnston was still afloat for one reason. The Japanese were trying too hard to kill it. They were firing armor-piercing, AP, shells from their battleships, shells designed to penetrate the 16-inch belt armor of an American battleship. The Johnston's hull was half an inch thick. When these massive AP shells hit the tin can, there was nothing to arm the fuse. The shells passed times clean through times the ship in one side and out the other without detonating, leaving two neat, round holes. The Johnston's very weakness, its tin can construction, was the only thing saving it from being instantly vaporized. The ship was a ruin. It was barely making 17 knots. It was steering by a bloody, half-blind captain shouting into a hatch. It was on fire from bow to stern. It had done everything. It had charged. It had launched its torpedoes. It had crippled a heavy cruiser. It had come back, taken on a battleship, and survived. It had duelled with cruisers and destroyers at point-blank range. The ship was, by all accounts, finished. It was a floating coffin, its guns falling silent one by one as power failed. But it was still there. It was still floating. It was still a target. And by being a target, it was still buying seconds, minutes, for the carriers. This burning, defiant wreck, the very symbol of Taffy 3's suicidal courage, was about to get help from the last place anyone expected, the sky. While the tin cans were bleeding on the surface, a new, desperate battle was beginning. On the decks of the Taffy 3 carriers, it was pure chaos. The jeep carriers were under direct fire from battleships. 18.1-inch, 16-inch and 14-inch shells were landing around them, throwing up columns of water so high they drenched the flight decks. The carrier Gambia Bay was already taking hits, slowing and falling behind. This was a situation naval doctrine had no answer for. Carriers were not supposed to be in a gunfight. They were supposed to be 50 miles away, safe behind their screens. Now they were the front line. Yet in this panic there was purpose. Pilots were scrambling, running to their planes TBM, Avengers and FM2 Wildcats. There was no time for a coordinated plan, no time for proper briefing, and most importantly, no time to arm the planes with the correct weapons. From the cockpits, the pilots, many on their first combat tours, were looking at a scene of utter insanity. As they were catapulted into the air, they looked down to see their own destroyers, burning and sinking, still firing. And on the horizon, they saw the unbelievable, the pagoda masts of the entire Japanese center force. The radio channels, which were supposed to be models of calm procedure, erupted. Survivor accounts and radio transcripts recall a babble of pure, unadulterated shock and rage. "My God, look at the size of that thing," one pilot screamed. Another, his voice tight with disbelief, radioed, "I'm attacking a battleship." Admiral Sprague, from his flagship, gave the only order that made sense. He broke all doctrine and ordered every pilot into the air, with a simple command that became legendary. "I don't know what you've got. Get 'em. Get to 'em. Attack." What they had was, by all measures, pathetic. This was the makeshift air war. The planes of Taffy 3 were armed for their real mission, ground support for the troops on Leyte and anti-submarine patrols. They were not armed to fight a battleship fleet. The FM-2 Wildcats, the fighters, had only their 50 caliber machine guns. The TBM Avengers, the torpedo bombers, were a tragic misnomer. Most had no torpedoes. They were loaded with light 100-pound fragmentation bombs, 500-pound general-purpose bombs, or, in some cases, only anti-submarine depth charges, which were useless against a surface ship. But they went anyway. The pilots, imbued with the same suicidal courage as the destroyer crews, improvised. They did not attack to sink. They attacked to times annoy asterisk. They attacked to harass, to distract, and to die, if it meant buying time. The Wildcats, with nothing else to use, made strafing run after strafing run on the exposed bridges of the Japanese cruisers and battleships, their 50 caliber bullets, as one pilot said, like bouncing peas off a tin roof. They were completely ineffective against armor, but they were times devastating, times against the men, the rangefinders, and the anti-aircraft crews. The most brilliant and desperate tactic was the dummy run. The Avenger pilots, who had no torpedoes, knew that the Japanese captains were pathologically afraid of torpedoes. The pilots made their runs, but instead of dropping a fish, they would drop a depth charge, a glove, a ration pack, anything just to make a splash. Or they would fly straight and level, right at the battleship, opening their bomb bay doors, asterisk pretending times to launch a torpedo. This bluff was, in many ways, more effective than a real attack. The Japanese ships, seeing the profile of a TBM Avenger coming at them, did not wait to see what it dropped. They immediately went into a hard, evasive turn, combing the wakes of torpedoes that didn't even exist. This was the tactic that truly saved the carriers. The Japanese fleet, which had been in a loose pursuit, was now scattering, turning, and zigzagging, completely unable to maintain a firing solution as they dodged imaginary torpedoes from a swarm of angry jeep carrier planes. This was the industrial, divided by statistical hammer of the air war. It was not a hammer of steel, but of psychology. The physical damage done by the Taffy 3 air groups was, in the grand scheme, minimal. They scored a few 500-pound bomb hits and strafed some superstructures. But the psychological impact was catastrophic for the Japanese. Admiral Kurita and his captains were designed to fight a methodical, set-piece battle against other battleships, or to defend against a single, massive, coordinated airstrike from fleet carriers. They were not, in any way, prepared for this. They were being pecked to death by a swarm of flies. They were facing a two-front, multi-axis, and completely chaotic attack. From the surface, the tin cans were charging them, firing torpedoes. From the air, planes were strafing them from all directions, forcing them to maneuver. The Japanese gunnery officers, their calculations thrown off by their own ship's violent turns, could not concentrate. The anti-aircraft gunners were being shredded by 50 caliber fire. The lookouts were screaming about torpedoes that were not there. The entire Japanese plan, a plan of overwhelming industrial force, was being unraveled by a handful of men with the wrong weapons. The air attacks, combined with the sacrifice of the destroyer Wolfpack, had broken the Japanese momentum. The 1,000 cuts from the air, added to the mortal wounds from the torpedoes, had created a level of chaos that Kurita's fleet could not manage. But the cost was mounting. The carriers had launched their planes, but they themselves were still under fire. The destroyer screen was, by now, effectively gone. The planes were running out of fuel and ammunition, their pilots landing back on the carriers, rearming with whatever was available, and launching again, sometimes in a matter of minutes. The battle was reaching its absolute climax. The Japanese were still there, and they were still overwhelmingly powerful. The question was, had the sacrifice of the tin cans and the courage of the pilots been enough? From the bridge of the Japanese flagship Yamato, the battle off Samar was supposed to be a simple, brutal execution. It was a fleet action against what appeared to be light, unescorted carriers. By every calculation of Japanese naval doctrine, it should have been over in 20 minutes. Instead, more than an hour into the engagement, the Japanese center force was not in a state of victory, but in a state of complete and utter chaos. The unraveling of Kurita's force was not an industrial defeat, it was a psychological and systemic collapse, a death by 1,000 cuts inflicted by men who should have already been dead. The cohesion of the most powerful surface fleet assembled during the war was being shattered, not by superior firepower, but by smoke, phantoms, and the sheer, suicidal audacity of a few tin cans. The butcher's bill for the Japanese, specifically for their heavy cruiser division, was staggering, and it was a direct result of the tin can charges. The USS Johnston, in its initial run, had effectively executed the heavy cruiser Kumano. Its torpedoes had blown the bow completely off the 13,000-ton ship, forcing it to crawl away from the battle, a blazing wreck. But the damage did not stop there. The heavy cruiser Chokai, which had been targeted by the absurdly small destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, was now in mortal agony. The Sammy B's torpedo had crippled its steering, and its relentless 5-inch gunfire, combined with strafing from the Taffy 3 aircraft, had turned its superstructure into a slaughterhouse. It was burning uncontrollably. Then there was the Chikuma, another heavy cruiser that had been the focus of the Johnston's guns after its torpedo run. Battered by over 200 rounds of 5-inch shells and hounded by air attacks, the Chikuma was also on fire and falling out of formation. In less than an hour, the suicide tactics of Taffy 3's screen had systematically neutralized an entire Japanese heavy cruiser division. 3 of the most powerful ships in Kurita's fleet were, for all intents and purposes, mission killed. This chaos extended to the very heart of the fleet, the battleship Yamato. The largest, most powerful warship ever built, a 72,000-ton symbol of imperial industrial might, was reduced to a state of near helplessness. Officers on her bridge, as documented in post-war accounts, described a scene of profound frustration. The Yamato's 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval guns in existence, had fired. They had contributed to the sinking of the carrier Gambia Bay. But for most of the battle they were silent, not for a lack of targets, but for a lack of a stable times targeting solution. This was the dual conflict of the battle, the ultimate 20th century technology being rendered impotent by primitive, desperate tactics. The TBM Avengers from Taffy 3, most with no torpedoes, were making repeated dummy runs. The Yamato's lookouts, spotting the American torpedo bombers, would scream "Torpedo!" The ship, understanding orders to take no risks, would go into a hard, evasive turn, combing the wakes of torpedoes that were not there. At one point, the Yamato was forced into a full 180-degree turn, steaming times away from the battle, to escape a phantom torpedo attack. The world's largest battleship was being chased off by planes that were, in some cases, armed with nothing but machine guns. The industrial divided by statistical hammer of Taffy 3's victory was not a hammer of firepower, but a hammer of systems collapse. The Japanese fleet was a massive industrial machine, designed to execute a precise kill chain. Find, fix, track, target, engage. Taffy 3, with its desperate improvised tactics, broke every single link in that chain. First, the find and track links. Admiral Sprague had ordered his carriers to flee toward a fortuitous rain squall, and the destroyers had laid a smoke screen so thick it blinded the Japanese lookouts and their superior optics. The Japanese could no longer see their primary targets. Second, the target link. The suicidal charges of the Johnston, Hole, and Samuel B. Roberts forced the Japanese capital ships to target switch. Instead of focusing on the carriers, the battleships and cruisers were forced to engage the tin cans, which were a more immediate, though less valuable, threat. Third, the engage link. The torpedo soup from the destroyers, combined with the dummy runs from the air, forced the Japanese fleet to break formation. They could not engage as a cohesive unit because they were too busy dodging real and imagined threats. The American Wolfpack and the swarm of aircraft had systematically disassembled the Japanese war machine. The Japanese center force was not defeated. It was time's disintegrated asterisk. Its cohesion as a fighting fleet was gone. The individual ships were still powerful, they were still afloat, and they still had thousands of rounds of ammunition. But the fleet itself was broken. The ships were scattered. The command and control system was in shambles, paralyzed by the sheer, illogical nature of the American response. Admiral Kurita, on the bridge of the Yamato, was receiving a flood of conflicting and terrifying reports. His cruisers were burning, torpedoes were in the water, and American aircraft were attacking with a ferocity that suggested he was facing a full fleet carrier task force, not a handful of jeep carriers. The battle was not over, but the Japanese plan was. The American light raspberry had, through sheer, unadulterated gay conviction, shattered the Japanese sledgehammer. This chaos, this total unraveling of the Japanese plan, would now lead to the single most enigmatic and controversial decision of the entire Pacific War. The USS Johnston was now a ghost. She was a burning, listing wreck, a junkyard of twisted steel that somehow still answered the helm. Her bridge was gone. Her forward engine room was a flooded, blackened tomb. Her main battery was half destroyed, with power lost to the aft guns. Her captain, Ernest E, was a mangled, bloody apparition, still alive, still in command, steering his ship by shouting commands down a hatch at the stern. By every rule of naval warfare, the Johnston was dead. She had fired her torpedoes. She had crippled a cruiser. She had duelled with battleships. Her fight was over. But as the ship, now crawling at 17 knots, cleared a smoke bank, Commander Evans saw a new threat. A squadron of Japanese destroyers, a tin can Wolfpack of their own, was breaking through. They were in a perfect firing position, launching a torpedo spread at the jeep carriers of Taffy 3. The carriers had no idea. The other American destroyers were sunk, sinking, or too far away. There was no one left to intercept. No one, except the ghost of the Johnston. Evans, bleeding on the fantail, did not hesitate. He had no torpedoes left. He had only a few working guns and a ship that was moments from capsizing. He did the only thing he knew how to do. He ordered the Johnston to attack. He turned his crippled ship, what was left of it, directly toward the Japanese destroyer squadron. It was a final, magnificent act of defiance. The Johnston's remaining 5-inch guns, the forward mounts, opened fire. They were in a point-blank range duel, a knife fight in a phone booth with an enemy that was fresh and undamaged. The goal was not to sink the Japanese destroyers. That was impossible. The goal was to spoil their aim. The Johnston, in its death throes, was charging the Japanese torpedoes, its guns blazing, a screaming, burning distraction. The Japanese destroyers, astonished at this zombie ship rising from the smoke, were forced to target the Johnston. They turned their guns away from the carriers and focused their fire, pounding the American destroyer with shell after shell. The Johnston's final charge had worked. The Japanese torpedo run was scattered. Their aim was spoiled. The torpedoes ran wild, and the carriers were saved. But this final act of courage had sealed the Johnston's fate. The ship was now completely surrounded. The Japanese destroyers, including the Times Yukikaze asterisk, formed a circle around the dying American ship. There was no more maneuvering. There was no more chasing salvos. This was an execution. The Japanese ships, from a range of a few thousand yards, methodically pumped shell after shell into the Johnston's hull. The ship, which had survived 14-inch battleship shells, was now being torn to pieces by 5-inch destroyer fire. One by one, the last guns fell silent. The last engine room flooded. The ship went dead in the water, a floating inferno. On the fantail, Commander Evans, seeing the ship was finished, finally gave the order he had held back for 2.5 hours. Abandon ship. The scene, according to survivors like Robert Hagen, was one of nightmarish calm. Men, many wounded, began to drop over the side into the oil-slicked water. The ship was sinking beneath their feet. Robert Hagen recalled seeing Commander Evans. The captain, mutilated and bloody, was not leaving. He had done his duty. He had brought his ship in harm's way, and he would not leave it. The last time anyone saw Ernest E. Evans, he was on the fantail, his ship's stern already awash, not screaming, not crying, but standing, looking at his men in the water. One of the most enduring, though unconfirmed, accounts from the battle came from the other side. A Japanese destroyer captain, from the Times Yukikaze Times Squadron, reportedly watched the Johnston's final moments. He saw the defiant captain on the stern as the ship went down. In a moment of pure, warrior-to-warrior respect, the Japanese captain, observing the end of the bravest ship he had ever seen, rendered a slow, deliberate salute. The Johnston, after 2 hours and 40 minutes of continuous, impossible combat, finally gave up its fight. Her bow rose high in the air, and she slipped beneath the waves, leaving her survivors in the water. The industrial divided by statistical hammer of this fight was the butcher's bill for the Taffy 3 screen. The sacrifice of the tin cans was now complete, and the cost was staggering. The USS Johnston, which had led the charge, was gone. Of her 327-man crew, only 141 survived. 186 men, including Commander Ernest E. Evans, were killed. The USS Howell, which had charged the battleship Congo, was also sunk. Of her crew, 253 men were killed. And the DE that fought like a battleship, the USS Samuel B. Roberts, was also overwhelmed and sunk. 89 of her crew were lost. 3 ships, 3 captains who chose to fight, 3 crews who followed them into oblivion. These were the ships that had led the charge, that had absorbed the punishment, that had paid the ultimate price. The Johnston, the Howell, and the Sammy B were gone. The ghost of the Johnston had done its final duty. The ship was lost, but its mission was a spectacular, unbelievable success. It had crippled a heavy cruiser. It had drawn the fire of battleships. And, in its final moments, it had broken up a Japanese torpedo attack that could have annihilated the carriers. The Johnston, a 2,100-ton destroyer, had fought for 2.5 hours against the largest battleship fleet in the world, and it had won, paid for in the blood of its captain and its crew. The sacrifice of the Taffy 3 screen was now complete. The Japanese, having just been mauled by a force they should have vaporized, were now in a state of total confusion, a confusion that would lead to the most bizarre and controversial decision of the entire war. It was 9/11. The battle had raged for 2.5 hours. The American destroyer screen was annihilated. The Johnston, Howell, and Samuel B. Roberts were at the bottom of the ocean, or were sinking, broken and burning. The carrier Gambier Bay was sunk. The remaining jeep carriers were damaged and scattered. By every metric of naval warfare, the Japanese had won. The American light raspberry was smashed. Admiral Kurita's center force, though battered, was still overwhelmingly powerful. The path to the south, to the undefended American invasion shipping in Leyte Gulf, was now wide open. This was the moment of victory, the entire purpose of the Shogo plan. It was at this precise moment that Admiral Takeo Kurita, on the bridge of the super battleship Yamato, gave the most baffling, controversial, and decisive order of the entire Pacific War. Cease action. All ships, turn north. Rendezvous. The order was met with stunned disbelief by his subordinate commanders. They were Time's winning asterisk. The enemy was routed. The prize was just miles away. To turn north, away from the objective, was not just a retreat. It was an admission of defeat in the very moment of victory. This is the central enigma of the Battle off Samar. To understand it, one must leave the decks of the American tin cans and stand on the bridge of the Yamato, inside the mind of Admiral Kurita. He was not, as it turned in command of a victorious fleet. He was in command of a paranoid, shattered, and psychologically broken armada, a victim of the most successful bluff in military history. The fog of war on the Yamato's bridge was not a mist. It was a suffocating shroud. Kurita was a battleship admiral, trained for a single, decisive, set-piece engagement. He was not prepared for the chaos of Taffy 3. From his perspective, the American response was so suicidally aggressive, so well coordinated, and so relentless that it times could not times be coming from a mere escort screen. His post-war testimony and the accounts of his staff officers like Captain Tamechi Hara paint a clear picture. Kurita times believed times he was fighting the main American Third Fleet. He believed the carriers he was attacking were full-sized Essex-class fleet carriers, not jeep carriers. He believed the destroyers charging him, like the Johnston, were times heavy cruisers asterisk, as no mere destroyer would be so audacious. The dummy torpedo runs from the Taffy 3 aircraft. He believed they were real, coordinated torpedo strikes. The constant, harassing air attacks, while doing minimal material damage, had shattered the nerves of his fleet, forcing his ships to scatter and ruining his fire control. This was the dual conflict in Kurita's mind. His eyes and his superior optics told him the enemy was small, but his tactical doctrine and the sheer ferocity of the American resistance told him it was a trap. The men of the Johnston, Howell, and Samuel B. Roberts had fought with a courage that was, to the Japanese, incomprehensible. It was a courage that did not make sense unless it was part of a larger, overwhelming force that was just over the horizon. Kurita, having survived the sinking of his previous flagship in the Sibian Sea, was already exhausted and on edge. He was convinced, as he later testified, that he had stumbled into the maw of the entire American Pacific Fleet, and that the attacks by Taffy 3 were merely the bait to hold him in place, while Admiral Halsey's main battleship line closed in for the kill. Then came the bluff. As Kurita was wrestling with this phantom, his radio operators intercepted a series of desperate, uncoded American messages. Admiral Kincaid, whose 7th Fleet was being annihilated, was frantically trying to get Admiral Halsey to return. One of these messages, sent in the clear for the world to hear, was the final nail in the coffin of Kurita's will. It was Kincaid's famous plea, "Where is Task Force 34? The world wonders." Kurita and his intelligence staff intercepted this. To them, it was not a desperate plea, it was a tactical signal. Task Force 34 was the designation for Halsey's main battleship line. Kurita's blood ran cold. The message was, to him, confirmation of his deepest fears. It was proof. Task Force 34 was not only real, it was time's close asterisk. It was on its way. The world wonders was not poetry. It was a signal that the trap was about to spring. He was about to be caught between the carriers of Taffy 3 and the 16-inch guns of Halsey's battleships. This brings us to the final, crushing industrial, divided by statistical hammer of the battle, the non-battle that followed. Let us look at the facts. At 9/11, when Kurita gave the order to turn north, what did he have left? He still had 4 battleships, including the Yamato, the Nagato, the Congo, and the Haruna. He still had 3 heavy cruisers and 7 destroyers. This force was, by itself, still more powerful than the entire remaining 7th Fleet. And what was left of Taffy 3? A few scattered carriers, 1 destroyer, the Heermann, which was heavily damaged, 1 destroyer Escort. That was it. Kurita was not in a trap. He was times the trap. He had an overwhelming, unassailable industrial advantage. He was, at that moment, only a few miles from the undefended, transport-filled waters of Leyte Gulf. He could have sailed in and annihilated the entire American invasion, a catastrophe that would have set the Pacific War back by months, if not years. And he turned away. The enigma of Admiral Kurita's turn is the final, glorious and tragic vindication of the USS Johnston. The Johnston and its Wolfpack had not won an industrial victory. They had won a psychological one. They had not defeated the Japanese fleet with steel, but with will. The courage of Commander Evans and his fellow tin can captains was so profound, so illogical, that it created a phantom fleet in Kurita's mind. Kurita did not retreat from the battered, sinking remnants of Taffy 3. He retreated from the ghost of the Johnston. He retreated from an enemy that his doctrine said could not exist, but which his eyes had just seen. The sacrifice of the tin cans had not been in vain. They had traded their ships and their lives for the single greatest prize of the war, the mind of the enemy commander. The Japanese were gone. The horizon, which for 2.5 hours had been a wall of steel, smoke and coloured fire, was now empty. The deafening roar of 18-inch guns was replaced by a new, more terrible sound, the cries of men in the water. For the sailors of Taffy 3, the strategic victory was a concern for admirals. The reality for them was a new, more personal and more primitive battle for survival. The battle off Samar had ended, but the ordeal was just beginning. The sea was now a vast, oily graveyard, a floating testament to the cost of courage. It was littered with the wreckage of the USS Gambier Bay, the USS Johnston, the USS Hole, and the USS Samuel B. Roberts. And scattered among this debris, clinging to life rafts, nets, and pieces of floating wreckage, were hundreds of men. They were wounded, they were in shock, and they were alone. For the survivors of the USS Johnston, the transition from the chaotic, white-hot rage of battle to the cold, lonely fear of the ocean was instantaneous. Robert Hagen, the gunner who had watched his captain fight and die, was one of many who found themselves in the water. The initial moments were a frantic search for comrades, for life rafts, for anything that would float. But as the hours dragged on, the reality of their situation became clear. This was the dual conflict of man versus the sea. The first enemy was the Sunday. It was a relentless, tropical hammer, beating down on them, reflecting off the oily water, burning their skin and searing their eyes. Then came the thirst. Their mouths, caked with salt water and fuel oil, became cracked and raw. Delirium set in quickly. Men who had been heroes hours before were now whispering to imaginary wives, or, worse, drinking the seawater, an act that hastened their descent into madness and death. And then the sharks came. The battle off Samar is, for its survivors, a story defined by sharks. The explosions, the blood in the water it had drawn them in from miles around. The men, many of them badly wounded, were helpless. They formed circles, kicking their feet, trying to scare the predators away. But it was a losing battle. The sharks were patient. They would bump a man, testing him. If he was too weak to fight back, they would take him. Survivors' accounts are filled with the harrowing, specific details. The sudden scream in the night, the thrashing, and then the quiet, a life jacket floating empty. This was not the heroic death of a gunfight. It was a primitive, horrifying end. For 50 hours, the survivors of the Johnston and the Hoel endured this. They were not just fighting for their lives, they were fighting for their sanity as they watched their friends, one by one, be taken by the sea or by the predators beneath it. Compounding this physical torment was a new, more bitter dual conflict, their sense of abandonment. This was the battle of the forgotten. For 2 full days, the 7th Fleet, the navy they had just saved, had no idea where they were. In the chaos of the larger battle for Leyte Gulf, with Halsey's fleet returning and the Japanese in retreat, the survivors of Taffy 3 were a lost data point. The communications breakdown that had almost doomed them in the battle now doomed them in its aftermath. Friendly ships passed on the horizon. Search planes flew overhead, their pilots scanning for Japanese submarines, completely unaware of the hundreds of American sailors waving frantically from the water below. For the men in the D water, this was a new kind of hell. They had fought, they had won, and they had been forgotten. Their despair turned to rage. It was only on the third day, by a complete accident, that a landing craft, LCI, on a routine patrol stumbled upon a field of debris and, to its crew's horror, found it was a field of living men. The rescue, when it finally came, was a mix of unutterable joy and profound, bitter anger. Only then could the full, industrial, divided by statistical hammer of the battle be calculated. This was the final butcher's bill, the true cost of courage. Taffy 3 had lost 2 destroyers, the USS Johnston and the USS Hole. It had lost 1 destroyer escort, the USS Samuel B. Roberts. It had lost 1 escort carrier to gunfire, the USS Gambier Bay, which had the horrifying distinction of being one of the only US carriers sunk by naval gunfire in the war. And, in the immediate, chaotic aftermath, the carrier USS Street, Low, also of Taffy 3, was hit and sunk by the first organized kamikaze attack, a terrifying new industrial tactic of the desperate Japanese. In total, over 1,100 American sailors and airmen were killed in this single, short engagement. But the exchange ratio, paid for in blood, was staggering. In exchange for their own annihilation, the tin cans of Taffy 3 had directly contributed to the sinking of 3 Japanese heavy cruisers, the Chokai, the Chikuma, and the Suzuya, and the crippling of the Kumano. They had, in effect, traded 3 tin cans for 3.5 heavy cruisers. It was a price Kurita was, in the end, unwilling to pay. The men who were pulled from the water were skeletons. They were covered in saltwater sores, their bodies bloated from the sea, their minds haunted by what they had seen. The courage they had displayed had cost them their ships, their friends, and nearly their lives. They had paid for Kurita's turn in blood. This horrific, agonizing ordeal was the final chapter in their fight. They had defeated the enemy's steel, and then, in a test of pure endurance, they had defeated the ocean itself. Their sacrifice was now complete, and it had purchased a victory that was not just tactical, but one that would echo through the entire history of the US Navy. The Battle of Samar was over. The sea, now quiet, was a graveyard. The Japanese fleet, battered, confused, and psychologically broken, was in full retreat, not just from Samar, but from the war itself. The Imperial Japanese Navy, as a cohesive, industrial fighting force, would never again sally forth in such strength. The survivors of Taffy 3, skeletons pulled from the sea, were a testament to the battle's horrific cost. But what had that cost purchased? It had purchased the single most valuable prize of the Pacific War, the success of the Leyte Gulf landings. The hundreds of thousands of men on the beaches, the mountains of supplies, the fleet of defenseless transport ships, all of it had been saved, not by admirals or by a grand fleet, but by the suicidal, defiant, and glorious charge of a few tin cans. We return, then, to our thesis. This story, the story of the USS Johnston, was never merely a chronicle of a naval engagement. It was a testament to the precise moment when the cold, brutal arithmetic of industrial warfare, armor thickness, shell weight, and tonnage was challenged and, in the end, defeated by the unquantifiable variable of human will. The men of Taffy 3 were not supposed to win. By every metric, they were an execution waiting to happen. But they, and their commanders, refused to accept the logic of their own destruction. They had, in their defiance, done the impossible. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, the man who had commanded this light Raspberry against a main battle fleet, said it best in his after-action report. In a dispatch that resonated with the raw, emotional truth of the battle, he wrote, "The name of every man who was on a destroyer, destroyer escort, or carrier of Task Unit 77.4. 3 during the morning of the 25th of October 1944 should be engraved in gold, and a copy of the list posted on the wall of every man of war of the United States Navy for all time. The nation, when it finally learned the full story, agreed. The legacy of Taffy 3 was cemented in the honors it received. The entire task unit, Taffy 3, was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest honor that can be bestowed upon a ship and its crew. It was a recognition that this was not just a battle, but a singular, defining moment of collective valor. And for the man who had started it all, for the captain who had, by sheer force of will, turned a tin can into a battleship, the nation's highest honor was reserved. Commander Ernest E. Evans, the Cherokee fighter from Oklahoma, the man who had promised his crew he would go in harm's way, was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. He would never see it. He was listed, as all sailors who are lost to the sea are, as missing in action. His body never recovered. His medal was a symbol, a testament to a captain who embodied the Navy's highest ideals, a man who, though mutilated and dying, steered his ship from the stern by shouting commands through a hatch, fighting until the last man, the last gun, and the last moment. This, then, is the final, industrial divided by statistical hammer. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the colossal four-part engagement of which Samar was the bloody climax, was the end of the Imperial Japanese Navy. In this one massive battle, Japan lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. It was an industrial annihilation. They would never again be able to assemble a fleet. The war in the Pacific was not over, but the Naval Times war was. And this strategic, war-ending victory was purchased at Samar. The second statistic is even more profound. The Leyte landings were secured. General MacArthur's return to the Philippines, the entire liberation campaign, was allowed to proceed. The 1,100 American sailors who died in the waters off Samar did not die in vain. Their sacrifice, the 2.5 hours they held back the apocalypse, directly saved the tens of thousands of lives that would have been lost if Kurita had broken through and annihilated the undefended, transport-filled invasion fleet. The USS Johnston was a destroyer, a tin can. By design, it was an escort, a picket, a support ship. It was never intended to fight a battleship, but on the 25th of October 1944, this ship, and the man who commanded it, became something more. It became a spear. It became a shield. It became the defiant symbol of a navy that would not, and could not, be broken. The ship was lost. The captain was lost. But the battle, the invasion, and the future were won. The Johnston was, and forever will be, the ship that charged a battleship fleet and saved an invasion.